All right, started the recording. Thank you especially to those of you who are here in the synchronous session to give it a more human kind of feel. It's nice to see you all. We're going to talk about Karl Marx's 1844 Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts today. I got really excited reading this and annotating it today. I was like, oh, this is going to be fun. Before we do that, just one logistical note. I think last week I said something about your reading assignments being due on Mondays instead of Wednesdays from now on, but I had actually miscalculated the reading schedule, so my bad. So they're going to go back to Wednesdays. So that'll be sort of the rhythm of the semester. So just as you had your perusal reading annotations due today, September the 10th, your next one will be due a week from today, September the 17th. And those annotations will cover the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, which I said we would discuss today. And then on Monday, we will discuss the manifesto of the Communist Party. And so then your annotations that are due Wednesday will cover those two readings. So if you look at perusal, you'll see that I have annotated and posed a number of questions about the reading for today from the economic and philosophic manuscripts. So I think it's going to be pretty fun to discuss. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. And I may also backtrack to some things from the German ideology, which we discussed on Monday. Any questions before we get started from those of you who are here? I think things are finally going pretty smoothly now. Like I've kind of figured out this perusal system, how it links with Canvas. I've got the grade book, pretty much in order. I've got, I feel like I've got a handle now on the technological issues that were holding us up a little bit at the beginning. So now I'm feeling good and feeling like now we can do what we came here to do, which is talk about sociological theory. So let me go into the screen share mode and pull up the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. No, don't need Chance the Rapper today. If anybody has not heard has heard the new Chance the Rapper album, I think it's excellent. But that's not for class purposes here today. Nor do we need my writings. What do we need? We need this guy. Okay. Introduction to the manuscripts. Okay, so look, the first thing to say about these economic and philosophic manuscripts is that they were written when Marx was a very young man. These were written when he was 26 years old, and he was living in Paris at the time. And as a result, they have a kind of a poetic, very romantic kind of flavor to them that some of his later, more mature writings did not. This is an impassioned young man living in Paris who is angry about what he sees going on in the world around him. And so there are a couple of passages that I highlighted in the economic and philosophic manuscripts that I think kind of show this kind of poetic, romantic prose that Marx employs from time to time. Just trying to get a better lighting situation. I think that's better. So that is real something to kind of keep in mind, and I'll show you a couple of passages where I think we see the writings of an enraged young 20-something who's enraged by the injustices of the world. Like with the German ideology, the economic and philosophic manuscripts were not published during Marx's times. They're essentially a set of notebooks that he wrote as a young person. Um, but they are very important for kind of showing his the trajectory of his thought, how his ideas developed as a young person, and the way that he kind of broke from philosophy into this kind of social theory and social criticism. The German ideology was also not published during his lifetime. The German ideology was written in 1845 and 1846 by Marx and Engels, but not discovered again until like the 1930s. And the thing that's interesting about that is that people had a certain kind of interpretation or a reading of Marx that kind of came out of the Soviet Union and sort of like state communism, as you saw in the film that you watched. Um, but when these earlier manuscripts were kind of discovered from the 1840s, they show a very different kind of Marx. They show a young, impassioned, philosophical, poetic kind of figure, not simply somebody who's just interested in the dry facts of economics. And so I will, like I said, kind of show you some of those passages where we see this kind of flavor. Marx would eventually be kicked out of France for his political activity in 1845, and he will eventually end up in living in London after 1849. So let's get into it. Alienated labor. So in this first paragraph, Marx gives us this sentence that we have proceeded from the premises of political economy. We have accepted its language and its languages and its laws. Okay, so for the whole paragraph, what he's saying here is that he's basically beginning with these basic premises or assumptions of what today we would call economics, of economists who are pro-capitalist, like Adam Smith, sort of the godfather of capitalist economic thought, and David Ricardo. And he kind of is like reading them against the grain. And he's reading them from this kind of critical angle. He's like a side eye or something, you know. And from that side eye, he's going to show that their own ideas, the ideas of people like Smith and Ricardo, show that as more wealth accumulates, he says the worker sinks to the level of the most wretched commodities. So the world gets richer and like the worker gets poorer, becomes a wretched commodity. A commodity is anything that is for sale. And this includes now people and their capacity to work, their labor power. And at the same time, he says that happens, capital becomes accumulated in a few hands. Capital becomes concentrated among a smaller and smaller kind of elite, what today we would call monopoly or oligarchy, where like the 1% of society, owns and controls this huge amount of wealth, and it's becoming more and more concentrated. Where like Elon Musk is set to become the world's first trillionaire now. So he is highlighting here that capitalism becomes increasingly unequal, becomes polarized between the haves and have-nots. And that's not because the system is broken. That's not because it's because capitalism isn't working. It's because that's exactly the way it's supposed to work. That it's like a rigged system. It's fixed. It's not broke, it's fixed. It's fixed to funnel money and value up to a small elite, while those who are doing the work are reduced to the most wretched commodities. So this is where he basically begins. In this next paragraph, Precious, I think you raised, you summarized it well. As far as what the point here of basically these next two paragraphs, but especially this one, is to show that in order to understand this system, we have to think holistically. We have to think about how these things are deeply interconnected. This is the words that Precious uses to describe it. That all these aspects that are listed here, you know, private property, avarice, avarice means kind of like greed, the separation of labor, capital and landed property, exchange, competition, value, all of these factors have to be understood as elements that are interconnected with one another. And so in order to understand this system, we have to understand it holistically as a system, and we have to be able to like diagnose that system, in the same way that like a doctor would diagnose the body, not by like isolating some particular element, but by thinking holistically about the entire system to understand how the parts of that system are interrelated with one another. That has to be our frame of mind if we're going to understand capitalism as a social system. And then in this next paragraph, Guadalupe, I don't think you're here, but Guadalupe raises this good sort of summary and point that what is being talked about is what we discussed in last class as ideology. Ideology, remember, is defined as the dominant ideas that serve to justify the inequalities of a class society. The ideas that legitimate, that justify, that rationalize, that make inequality seem acceptable, natural, normal, and so forth. And what Marx is saying in this paragraph is that economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo
Just the professor's frozen?
Yeah.
there. Did I lose? It felt like I lost a connection. Okay, you're back. Sorry for that brief interruption. I got to go back to the screen share. Hi, thanks, Brennan. I was like, I don't know what happened there. Okay, let me see. Okay, connection is back. Okay, so I must have lost a brief connection. Okay, so he uses this phrase, where is it? Fictitious primordial condition, so that like he's saying like the economists of his time, they basically imagine that the relationships of capitalism are part of like human nature, that they're a primordial condition in the sense that they're function, they're like fundamental to humanity as a primates, as a species, that they're primary attributes. So what he's saying is basically like these economists try to make capitalism seem like it's natural, like it's human nature, that like people are inherently greedy, um, that, people are always like trying to trade and maximize their interests, and that people are inherently like self-serving. That's what that phrase, a fictitious primordial condition, refers to here. And he's basically saying, well, first of all, this is most of human history. This has not been true. As I mentioned in last class, for most of human history, there was no such thing as private property. People held land and resources were like commonly owned. The idea that you could have that like somebody could own a piece of land was almost like unthinkable, to like many indigenous groups. Private property is something that was like socially and historically introduced. It is not natural. It is not something that like for most of human history, people have not lived that way. Um, and so Marx is saying here at the end of this paragraph that what they do is they assume as fact in historical form what has to be explained. Right down here. And so they're basically saying, well, they just assume that people are just like greedy and they always want to like maximize their interests and they're always trying to trade and barter and get the best deal and so on and so forth. But this is something that like has to be explained. How did we get here? How did we get to that point where, clearly now in a capitalist society, yeah, people are greedy and they want to maximize their interests and they're always looking for a better deal. Of course, that's true now. But how did we get there? How did we get here to this point historically? The economists just kind of assume that this has always been true, that like people just like are inherently like this. But historically, we know this is not the case. And so they're kind of like assuming what needs to be explained, assuming something as a, fictitious primordial condition that has to be explained um, historically. Now it looks like my perusal is going out. All right, perusal is coming back in. Come on, perusal. Any questions or comments so far yet from those of you who are here? You can
I
tell when I was
did
like,
have a question. Oh,
go
sorry.
ahead.
I did have a question about what you were saying before. So basically, what they're trying to do is like condition our way of thinking so that we how did I put it? Is it I'm gonna read what I wrote. Is
Yeah,
it like conditioning us to think things should be a certain way so that we don't rebel or expose their agenda?
exactly.
Okay.
That's exactly the case. And
Okay.
that is the case. That is what ideology serves to do. Ideology is like a low key kind of brainwashing. It's a kind of like manipulation that makes the existing state of things with all their inequalities and injustices, it makes those things seem like they're natural and like that's just the way things have to be, or it makes them seem like that's like they're God given, like they're supernaturally created, they're divine, when in fact they are social constructions. They are the products of history and society, not the products of nature or some supernatural force. And this is an important lesson that Marx is trying to teach us. Because if these things are the product of society and history, then we can change them as people. Like if they're the products of like nature and biology or God or whatever, like then we're just powerless. then we really just have to like accept like, oh, the 1% is just going to own everything and the rest of us are just going to be, these wretched commodities. But Marx is saying we don't have to accept that. Like that it's not natural. It's social and historical, and therefore people can change it. You know, people have to get together, they have to organize, they have to act, they have to do all these things, but it's possible. That's what he's suggesting. We don't have to just like take it lying down, you know. Yeah.
Okay.
Um,
Okay, I understand. And so basically, like with everything that we've learned from Marx, like how we are distracted with so many different issues that we can't focus on the same point in the same way that these people are trying to condition our way of thinking. How can we ever have anything similar to like an equal society with all these safe barriers in place to prevent us from being able to reach complete autonomy?
Excellent question. Also, um, I think Marx is saying it's not easy, but he's saying it's possible, right? So people have to unlearn and kind of, uncondition themselves in all kinds of various ways. People have to be kind of like re-educated and develop a kind of a revolutionary consciousness in which they, get rid of all the old baggage that they've learned, and been socialized into all the old ideologies, that they've been inculcated with. Um, so it isn't, it certainly is not, no one, including Marx, imagined that this was going to be easy. He's just kind of saying that it's possible because these things are the result of society and history, not nature or religion. Does that kind of answer your question, Precious?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And it's kind of like he's kind of like it's up to the people themselves to figure out how to do that. Remember, I said this last time that there were people in Marx's time who tried to plan like the blueprint for the revolution, and Marx kind of made fun of them. He said like there can be no cookbook for the revolution. People have to figure it out themselves how to do it. And it's the height of arrogance to think that some intellectual, some philosopher or whatever is just going to like figure it out. And then like the rest of us will just follow that blueprint or that cookbook. He's like, it's something that like I can point you to some, kind of like guidelines or goalposts, but like people are going to have to figure out how to change the system and how to create a better one. They're going to have to do that on their own. Like no intellectual can just tell them like to do it, like a general in an army or something. This is something people have to
Yeah,
figure out.
yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And
Okay.
I'm also gonna turn my camera on because my son's home now. Off.
Okay. No worries. Okay. Um, mm, Now here is where we begin the topic of what he calls alienation. Um, Here's where Marx begins to describe the process of alienation, and he describes it as a kind of separation. Okay, so when you see the word alienation, you might associate it with like a separation, and it's one where the things that people produce appear as a power independent of the producer. Okay, so that is kind of the way that alienation is defined here is the things that we produce, what he calls labor's product in this sentence, confront those who produce it as in power independent of the producer. A good way I like to think about this is the story of Frankenstein. You all know the story of Frankenstein? It's like this doctor was like working along at his laboratory, with this, with all kinds of using like the newest science and technology. And then the thing that he creates becomes this monster. And the monster confronts him as an independent being who's trying to destroy him, right? Frankenstein comes back to haunt his creator. Frankenstein was a very popular story in Marx's time. It was written in 1818. It was the same year that Marx was born. And so it's a kind of a parable about the dangers of science and technology, that Frankenstein is. Frankenstein is a parable about the dangers of science and technology in the sense of like, oh, we create these things that then come back to haunt and destroy us. All right. So it's that kind of relationship here that Marx is saying plagues the worker in a capitalist society. That we create as workers these objects, these commodities, these services, these all of this stuff we create, and then that world of commodities acts as like this independent power, this independent being that crushes our lives, yeah, as workers. So it's a kind of like a tragic irony that we are destroyed by the very things that we create. Another way of thinking about it is like that movie Alien, where the little alien like pops out of the chest, and then it runs around the spaceship and like torments all the passengers on the spaceship. Same kind of thing. That's something that's internal to us, something that's some kind of creative power, something that we make through our labor, then becomes like, takes on like a life of its own that confronts us and exercises power over us as if it was independent of its producer. So I'm just going to add actually to this one, if I can add to this. I'm just going to put think Frankenstein. All right. So that's what he means by alienation. And he's basically going to enumerate 4 dimensions of alienation, 4 ways that like the worker is alienated under conditions of capitalism. And I think that you'll see that many of them are still like true. Okay. So the next paragraph, this is a very important paragraph. This one that I've highlighted here. Because here, he's defined what he means by alienation. And then in this paragraph, he compares the alienation of labor under capitalism to religion. So he basically is saying that in both cases, these are social constructions that take on a life of their own against those who have created them. He's kind of suggesting here that like religion is this thing that's like, it's like man-made in one sense. It's like the product of people's imaginations and people's, like, they project onto the gods or God like their own ideas, their fears, their desires. Religion is this thing in which it's the product of the human imagination, but then it takes on this independent being outside of us, outside of its creators, that we then bow down to and worship and become subservient to. So here again, people become subservient to the very things that they create. That is how the alienation of labor compares with what he's saying about religion. A lot of you may disagree with his characterization of religion as something that's purely man-made or purely socially constructed. That's totally fine. I don't want to step on your own theological beliefs. So I've just kind of posed it as a question. It might be really interesting for those of you who have an interest in religion, to think about, to look at this passage and ask yourself, based on this, how do you think Marx views religion? You know, what do you think he thinks is at work? Because he describes again this same idea. What does he say? There's a couple of sentences here. He says right here, like, it is the same in religion. He says, the more man puts into God, the less he retains in himself. And then he compares it with work. He says, the worker puts his life into the object, but now his life no longer belongs to him, but to the object. Hence, the greater this activity, the greater is the worker's lack of object. And yeah, I'm just trying to see if there's anything else here that I want. So this is there's a couple of spaces in this reading where he makes this same kind of comparison. I'll show you the other ones here in a minute. But it's a pretty interesting way of thinking about the way that religion is like this social man-made construct that then comes to have this power over us. You know, this power over the humans who have created it. Um, remember when I said, like, you know, this is the product of a 26-year-old young man living in Paris, who's got, well, the way my dad would say it, he's full of piss and vinegar, you know, like he's like upset with the injustices and inequalities of the world. And so he's kind of spits a little fire here in the next two paragraphs. And it's kind of like they're exaggerated and they're overstated, but they have a certain kind of poetic, you know, kind of flavor, where he says, like, the more the worker produces, the less he has to consume. The more values he creates, the more valueless. The more unworthy he becomes, the better formed his product. The more deformed becomes the worker, the more civilized his object, the more barbarous becomes the worker. The mightier labor becomes, the more powerless becomes the worker. The more ingenious labor becomes, the duller becomes the worker, and the more he becomes nature's bondsman. And so he's kind of saying, you know, like that the world kind of goes in this opposite direction, that those who are creating the wealth and are creating value and are creating the objects become themselves more, not just poorer, but like more dehumanized. They are robbed of a certain kind of humanity. And that's what he will have to say about alienation, is that in some ways it's a process of dehumanizing the worker, robbing them of something that's fundamental to their humanity. So he does it here again, like, you know, it is true that labor produces for the rich wonderful things, but for the worker, it produces privation. It produces palaces, but for the worker, hovels. It produces beauty, but for the worker, deformity. It replaces labor by machines, but some of the workers it throws back into a barbarous type of labor, and other workers it turns into machines. It produces intelligence, but for the worker, idiocy, cretinism. Again, these might be a little overstated, but you want to see, and in some cases maybe not overstated, but in some cases maybe so. But I want you to get this. I think this really gives you a sense of the fire in the belly of this young man, and how this would lead him to a lifelong scholarly pursuit of trying to understand this capitalist system that he considered so unequal, and unjust. Okay, so now here is where, remember I just said a second ago, Marx gives us 4 dimensions of alienation. This is like basically the worker is alienated in these 4 aspects, and so here and they all kind of build on each other. They're not separate. Each of these 4 are kind of cumulative. So the first one is one he says, he asks what then constitutes the alienation of labor. He says, first, the fact that labor is external to the worker, it does not belong to his essential being. That in his work he does not affirm himself but denies himself, does not feel content but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical and mental energy, but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. The worker, therefore, only feels himself outside his work, and in his work feels outside himself. He is at home when he is not working, and when he is working, he is not at home. His labor is therefore not voluntary, but coerced. It is forced labor. It is therefore not the satisfaction of a need. It is merely a means to satisfy those needs external to it. Its alien character emerges clearly in the fact that as soon as no physical or other compulsion exists, labor is shunned like the plague. That last sentence kind of reminds me, like when people win the lottery and they're just like the first thing they do is run out and quit their jobs that they hate. It's like people, this again, this is a passage where we see, a young person with a certain amount of fire in the belly about the injustices and the dehumanizing nature of capitalism. He's talking about like how work comes to seem as this kind of alien activity that we are doing for somebody else's benefit, not for our own, and work as something that he says mortifies the body and ruins the mind. I am sure that many of us, perhaps all of us, have experienced this to some extent or another, and in some way or another. If you want to go off and just kind of describe your own kind of experiences with this kind of alienation of labor, I encourage you to do this. In fact, I'm going to add that right now to the chat as a question. Have you experienced this sort of alienation? So if you want to go on about some horrible job that you had or something like that, I'm here to hold space for you. Here again, he returns to the religion thing again. So here, the comparison with religion, right? I just mentioned. This is just as in religion, the spontaneous activity of the human imagination, of the human brain and the human heart operates independently of the individual. That is, operates on him as an alien, divine, or diabolical activity. In the same way, the worker's activity is not his spontaneous activity. It belongs to another. It is the loss of the self, of his self. So again, this analogy with religion and alienation of labor. Here he says religion is the spontaneous activity of the human imagination, of the human brain and the human heart. So in other words, it's something that he sees as man-made, as socially constructed, something in which the product of our brain and our heart, like our thoughts and our fears or our hopes or, our experiences are then projected onto, these things or these people that we call gods or God or, whatever it is, that no matter what the religion is, he's suggesting that this is the nature of the relationship, is that human beings and their imagination, their heads and their hearts, are the things that create these theological entities, which we then bow down to and worship and become subservient to. And so they operate on them as alien, divine, or diabolical. So here again, the comparison with religion. Now here is where he basically concludes that kind of as a result of this, human beings lose something that's fundamental to their humanity. So one thing to notice in reading the economic and philosophical manuscripts is that what Marx is doing is in the very process of talking about how human beings become alienated, he's also suggesting that there is this like human nature, or I would say it's not human nature so much as like human potential of like what human beings could be, and it's being robbed from us. It's being taken from us. We are being dehumanized under this system. We are becoming more like objects than people. So he says, as a result, therefore, the worker, no longer feels himself to be freely active in any but his animal functions, eating, drinking, procreating, or at most in his dwelling and in his dress up. And in his human functions, he no longer feels himself to be anything but an animal. What is animal becomes human, and what is human becomes animal. So that basically, like, he's suggesting that we are kind of dehumanized in the sense that we are being reduced, and something that's fundamentally human, like our ability to create, our ability to produce, to produce in like a meaningful way, is being stolen. It's being robbed from us and then being put in the service of these capitalists who are exploiting our work, like a parasite that exploits the host that it feeds off of. That's certainly what he's saying. He says, like, certainly eating, drinking, procreating, etc., are also genuinely human functions, but in the abstraction which separates them from the sphere of all other human activity and turns them into sole and ultimate ends, they are animal. So, like, yeah, we all eat, drink, and procreate, but there is something more to being a person than those activities, because those are all things that animals do too. And so this will become more evident as we go into the reading. He's suggesting here that there's this like kind of fundamental difference between people and other animals, and it has something to do with like the way that we create and produce, in a way that uses our imagination. He calls it Marx calls it conscious life activity. And this conscious life activity that separates humans from other animals is being taken from us, is being robbed from us. We are alienated from that very thing that makes us special as human beings. And so again, you're free to disagree with, you'll see like how he makes this distinction between people and other animals. So feel free to agree or disagree with that characterization, but that's essentially what he's saying here. Okay, so then in the next paragraph, he basically summarizes the first dimension of alienation. You just see in this paragraph he has a 1 and a 2. So the number 1 is basically like he summarizes that the first dimension of alienation is that we are alienated from the products of our labor, from the things that we produce. And then the second dimension, he says basically we're alienated from the act of production, from the process of production, from the work process. So we're not only alienated from the things that we produce, but we're alienated from the process of producing them. We don't have any say in how things are made, how fast they are made, of what quality the things that we make. All of those things are left up to management and to, the owners and to the capitalists. The workers just go in and they do what they're told. And in the process of doing what they're told, they are kind of robbed of their what Marx sees as like their creative decision-making abilities, or at least their potential to be creative and to collectively make decisions and then to execute those decisions. So he says in this after he in number 2, he says the relation of labor to the act of production within the labor process. This relation is the relation of the worker to his own activity as an alien activity not belonging to him. It is activity as suffering, strength as weakness, begetting as emasculating, the worker's own physical and mental energy, his personal life, or what is life other than activity, as an activity which is turned against him, neither depends nor belongs to him. Here we have self-estrangement, as we had previously the estrangement of the thing. So this is like a deeper level of alienation in which we kind of lose touch, not just with the things that we produce, but in some sense, like we lose touch with ourselves. We lose touch with our creative abilities. So then he goes on and introduces the third dimension. And this is what he calls alienation from our species being. When you see the term species being, you might think human nature. I think a better term for it than human nature is like human potential. Not necessarily what we are, but what we could be under the best circumstances. Under circumstances where we are allowed to thrive instead of, just survive. All right. So in this third dimension, he kind of defines what he means by species being. And I've posed the question for you to kind of interpret it, because he means our relationship to ourselves and also our relationship to nature. So capitalism in a way really separates us from nature, and separates us from our natural selves as well. This is kind of what he's suggesting here. And here is also where he's talking about the difference between people and other animals, and the way in which human beings have to are themselves part of nature, but also have to use nature, produce from nature to create the things that we need. So that's what he means here at the very end of this paragraph, where he's talking about nature is man's inorganic body, nature that is, insofar as it is not itself the human body. Man lives on nature means that nature is his body, which he must be in continuous intercourse if he is not to die. So we got to feed ourselves and, find water, and, we need nature. We need to be in continuous intercourse with nature. It's maybe an unfortunate choice of words, but we have to be constantly in some kind of an exchange with nature in order to survive. That's why things like today, the climate crisis is such an existential threat. because it threatens these natural conditions that we have to be in exchange with if we're not going to die, you know. So he says that man's physical and spiritual life is linked to nature means simply that nature is linked to itself, for man is part of nature. So usually like Western philosophy conceives of like man and nature as like separate things, and that's been a problem because it's like, well, nature is this thing out there that we can exploit and we can drill into and we can throw our plastic away into, because nature is this object out there, this thing. And Marx is like, no, actually, like human beings are in fundamental interplay with nature, and they have to maintain that exchange if they're not going to die. So this is a kind of a way of an alternative to like a dominant Western way of thinking, which is to think of nature as like this object, this thing that we can extract from, that we can take from in order to get rich, that we can extract all these resources and drill into and use as our, wastebasket. Um, Here's a little bit more where he is talking about what makes humans distinct from other animals, and I think this is a good kind of paragraph to think about, like a paragraph and a half, to think about again, like what is special about this thing he calls species being, and how our species being is being taken from us. So he starts by saying conscious life activity distinguishes man from animal life activity. So just hold on to that phrase, conscious life activity. This is the first clue about what he thinks is distinct about the human being, is that we have this thing he calls conscious life activity. Or it is only because he is a species being that he is a conscious being, that his own life is an object for him. Only because of that is his activity free activity. Estranged labor reverses this relationship so that it is just because man is a conscious being that he makes his life activity, his essential being, a mere means to his existence. So this thing that we do that is fundamentally human, like to produce, to create, becomes a thing that we just have to do to survive. It becomes just like a means to existence. And so when that happens, we are kind of robbed of something that's fundamentally human. Our conscious life activity becomes just like this thing that we have to do just to like put bread on the table. And so we don't really, we shun it like the plague if we don't have to do it. And then he goes a little bit more what he means in terms of like the difference, how this makes us distinct. He's like, admittedly, animals also produce, right? And animals are also producers. They build themselves nests, dwellings like the bees, beavers, ants. But an animal only produces what it immediately needs for itself or its young. It produces one-sidedly, while man produces universally. It produces only under the dominion of immediate physical need, while man produces even when he is free from physical need, and only truly produces in freedom therefrom. An animal produces only itself, whilst man reproduces the whole of nature. An animal's product belongs immediately to its physical body, whilst man confronts his product. An animal forms things in accordance with the standard and the need of the species to which it belongs, whilst man knows how to produce in accordance with the standard of every species and knows how to apply everywhere the inherent standard to the object. Man, therefore, also forms things in accordance with the laws of beauty. All right, so you may agree or disagree with Marx's characterization of the difference between humans and non-human animals. But what he is essentially saying here is the thing that separates us is this thing called conscious life activity. That I think a good way to think of it is in another passage. He says the difference between the best bee and the worst architect is that the worst architect draws up their plan like a blueprint in their imagination and then executes that plan in building a building, building a structure or whatever it is that they're building. Whereas a bee, it just comes naturally to the animal, or a beaver building a dam. This is put into their instinctual DNA. They don't, beavers don't have to go and draw up a blueprint of the dam that they're going to build. It's just like they're part of their natural activity, right? They don't have to go to like Beaver State University in order to like learn how to build a dam. But human beings exercise collective like life activity in the sense of like using their imagination, like strategizing, making a plan, making a blueprint, exercising their conscious life activity. And he suggests that this is something that's fundamentally human. And notice this sentence where he says that, whereas animals, they just produce what they need to produce out of physical need, the human being, he says, whilst man produces even when he is free from physical need and only truly produces in freedom therefrom. So like we create, even if we don't necessarily like need to. We make art, we make music, we tend to garden, we, do all kinds of activities, not because like we need to do them to survive physically, but because they're enjoyable, because it's fun and like self-expression to create stuff. And that is sort of a part of our species being, that we enjoy doing these things. And so, therefore, when that kind of conscious life activity is taken away from us, we experience this deep loss, this sense of alienation. We are robbed of something that is fundamental to us as humans. So, this is what he is basically illuminating here again, like through his criticism of alienation. He is trying to illuminate this idea of what humans could be. He's criticizing what is happening to people in the name of holding up an alternative model of what humans could be under different circumstances. So here he basically summarizes. He's like, okay, well, we're going to summarize part 3. You know, people are alienated from their species being, and then the 4th dimension, and the final dimension, is that people become estranged from each other. Basically, like it is man confronted by himself. He is confronted by the other man. What applies to a man's relation to his work, to the product of his labor, and to himself also holds of a man's relation to the other man and to the other man's labor and object of labor. So we experience other people, in other words, not as our fellow human beings, but as something like competition. We are divided from one another, separated from one another, separated from our fellow human beings. We experience them as hostile, as alien people rather than, like our fellow collaborators. And so as a result, capitalism creates this very individualized society of people who find themselves alone and isolated and estranged from each other, suspicious of each other. So I have posed the question in the chat, what kinds of alienation do we see today? If we were to dig Marx out of the grave and put him in America in 2025 and ask him to identify this fourth dimension of alienation, would he point at school shootings or road rage or, people's, alcohol and substance use, what kind of, bullying on social media? These are all things in which like we can find these pervasive examples, I think, of a profound alienation that people feel, in the sense of a separation from each other. So this also, put nicely here. This is a good discussion that um, Precious started here with about around the estrangement of man, and in fact, every relationship to themselves is first realized and expressed in the relationship in which man stands to other men. So this is what we call society, the relationships between people. And the relationships between people become hostile, aggressive, competitive, spiteful, in all sorts of ways, that are, again, fundamentally dehumanizing. So it's kind of like Marx is saying again that we're social beings. We need each other. We need to, we live in a society. We're not like individualized little atoms living on a desert island. And in order to survive and in order to thrive, we need people to cooperate with. We need other people in a community. We need each other. And yet these conditions of competition are dividing us against each other in a way that's hurting everybody. Let me make sure that I only have like a few minutes left, and I might have to wrap this up next time, but just wanted to point just a couple more things out. Here towards the end, he's basically saying like this is not simply going to be something that can be fixed with like paying a higher wage, right? Like you can pay workers a better wage and it allows them to live a better standard of living, and that's important, but it doesn't cure the problem of alienation. He says this amounts to nothing but better payment for the slave, right? So we just compensated more but still alienated. So you could find like people who are actually paid really well for their work. Like I got a lot of friends in the Bay Area who work in tech companies. They make a lot more money than I do, and yet they're profoundly alienated from their jobs. They're profound, like in every level, from the things that they produce to the way they produce them. The way their work is not like a fundamental expression of their species being, and they feel kind of alienated from society and their fellow human beings. So just because somebody's bringing in six figures, or I think he's suggesting even the capitalists who are profiting from this system also feel alienated. This is like this whole thing of like, money can't buy happiness, right? Like these are existential issues with human beings that can't be solved just by, with a higher wage. This last section is kind of a is kind of a fun. It's short, but it's basically about money. And here it kind of connects with what Marx had said in the previous section about alienation, because in this section he's describing like a world that's been turned upside down, and in which like money is in charge and people are doing the bidding of money. Like, so whereas money is supposed to just be like our tool or our instrument, a, a means of circulation. What happens is now money is in charge and people are subservient to money. So in the same way that he described religion as this process of like a world turned upside down, an inverted world, um, is also the case here with money. This is like money becomes the thing that dominates over people. And so that's what happens here, and what he's kind of describing. And again, like there's a kind of a poetic anger that he feels about this, that is unleashed in this paragraph, um, where he says, that which for me through the medium of money, that for which I can pay, i.e., which money can buy, that I am the possessor of money. He says, the extent of the power of money is the extent of my power. The extent of the power of money is the extent of my power. Money's properties are my properties and essential powers, the properties and powers of its possessor. Thus, what I am and am capable of is by no means determined by my individuality. I am ugly, but I can buy for myself the most beautiful of women. Therefore, I am not ugly, for the effect of ugliness, its deterrent power, is nullified by money. I, in my character as an individual, am lame, but money furnishes me with 24 feet. I don't exactly know what that means. Therefore, I am not lame. I guess 24 feet would allow you to be more physically, run faster or something. I am bad, dishonest, unscrupulous, stupid, but money is honored, and therefore so is its possessor. There's so many people I think of when I read that sentence, of people who are bad, dishonest, unscrupulous, and stupid, but because they have money, they are upheld, exalted in the society. I'm sure we can all think of our own examples of that. Again, like it's like money is doing the walking and the talking, and people are just kind of like holding the money, but the money's really in charge. The money's the one that, like, when one of these guys walks into the room, it's really the money that's walking into the room, and the person is just like the possessor of the money. They're just like the holder of the money, and the moment that they lose that money is the moment that they lose all this respect and status and the things that are attached to it. So it's not about the people. It says money transforms incapacities into their contrary, turns things into its opposite. Money has this like magical power to turn things into its opposite. So it says, what else? Money is the supreme good, therefore its possessor is good. Money, besides, saves me the trouble of being dishonest. I am therefore presumed honest. I am stupid, but money is the real mind of all things, and how then should its possessor be stupid? Besides, he can buy me talented people for himself, and is he who has the power over the talented not more talented than the talented? Do not I, who thanks to money and am capable of all that the human heart longs for, possess all human capacities? Does not my money therefore transform all my incapacities into their contrary? It turns the world upside down, makes things into their opposite. So here again, it might be like overstated, but you have to appreciate it for its kind of like poetic license. and it's using like exaggeration and rhetoric and this kind of angry tone of voice to convey an essential truth, that we live in a world where like um, money is in the saddle and riding us like a horse, riding people like a horse. Um, then he kind of flips this around here in this other paragraph. And he says, what happens when you don't have money? If I have no money for travel, I have no need. That is, no real and self realizing need to travel. If I have the vocation for study but no money for it, I have no vocation for study. That is, no effective, no true vocation. So, in contrast with that paragraph above, he's basically saying that, like, whereas people who have money, their individualities are, accentuated and exalted and brought up. Those without money, their potential, their capacities, their interests, their passions, their skills are all diminished. And so it kind of cancels out the merit of individuals, and again, turns things into its opposites. And so that's kind of the the sort of overall thrust of this passage, which is like, as he says here, money is thus the general overturning of individualities, which turns them into their contrary and adds contradictory attributes to their attributes. I think you can start to see like why Marx is so controversial in our time, as he's still like to this day like controversial, because he's like kind of going into the heart of our society and the very things that make it run. Any like a quick question or comment before we say goodbye for the day? All right. Thank you for being here. I wish you all a blessed day, and I'll see you on Monday. Have a good rest of your week and weekend. Okay. Bye.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.